And I have the privilege to introduce Veronica Amarante for the keynote speech of the first WAPLAC conference. And we are very honored that Veronica has accepted to make this plenary session. She's a professor at the Instituto de Economía from the Facultad de Ciencias, Economicas y de Administración at the Universidad de la República in Uruguay. She integrates the National System of Researcher. She's also a research fellow at the Partnership for Economic Policy, the network PEP. And she was previously the director of ECLAC office in Montevideo. And she worked for the Social Development Division of ECLAC at the United Nations. Her research interests are numerous, but in particular in development economics, gender and labor economics, with an emphasis on Uruguay and Latin America. And we are, of course, very honored to have her in WAPLAC and at this session. And I can also mention that she's the chair of the local committee for the LACEA conference that is going to take place, I think, in November this year. So, Veronica, again, thanks a lot for being with us today and for the speech you're going to make now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to deliver this lecture. I'm very glad of being in Costa Rica for the first time and of being here in this first workshop of WAPLAC. So my talk will be about gender and inequality in Latin America, and defined in this way. It's a very broad. Sorry, I will put the minutes. It's a very broad topic, so I should try to define it more precisely. And what I will be doing is presenting work on labor markets and on the domestic sphere also. So I will be leaving aside many other dimensions of gender inequality, for example, inequality in the political arena or inequality in education. So my focus will be on labor markets and on the domestic sphere. So before we dive into these gender inequalities, I should remind how it is important to discuss and to try to understand gender inequalities from the economics perspective. And the reasons are very simple and very straightforward. There is a fairness and justice reason, basically the need of equal opportunities for men and women. And there is also an efficiency reason, because there may be overall productivity and welfare losses if men and women are allocated with distortions in the labor market. So these are the main reasons why we should be concerned about gender inequalities. And I think that this figure presents how we have been studying gender economics from the point of view or from the approach of economics, and also what is happening now in this field of research. So what I call the tip of the iceberg is what we have been doing, like in more traditional economics, looking at gender differences in pay, gaps in labor market participation, gaps in pensions, gender gaps in informality, etc. And that has been, the economics has made a lot of advances in trying to understand the differences, the gender inequalities, and the causes. In the below the surface, there is an area of research of gender inequalities that is particularly at this moment very dynamic and very lively, that tries to look at things that are more difficult to measure, and that's probably why we are just from some recent years entering into this area. And it includes trying to understand much more complex processes that take place and are difficult, as I said, to grasp and to measure. And this area of research has been fueled by some important changes. For example, the availability of new data sources, like for time use surveys, but also data sources that came from other field or lab experiments, the methodological changes. For example, there is a very lively research based on experimental methods, and this is like allowing us to know a lot of some things about gender differences. And finally, the interaction between economics and other social sciences. And I think this is important because this is allowing us to depart from the maybe sometimes narrow vision of economics in terms of discrimination, etc., and trying to understand a bit more about the complex formation of stereotypes, gender norms, etc. So my talk will try to give you a general panorama about the situation of Latin America in what refers to the tip of the iceberg, and then present some work on some of these aspects that I was mentioning. Of course, this is a very broad scope, and what I will do is I will referring many times to work from other researchers and colleagues. So the first part will be, as I said, concentrating on what happens in Latin America in terms of gender inequalities. And before analyzing the labor market, it's important to have in mind the differences where we depart from, and that is the differences in education that nowadays are between women and men in the labor force in Latin America. And basically what we have is a reverse gender gap, as women are more educated than men. There you have the average years of education of active population, and if you look at the 22 last years, what has happened is that the gap, if something has become bigger because the path of accumulation of human capital of women has been more rapid than that of men. And there we also see the population with 13 or more years of education in Latin America, and again, women are more educated than men. So that's the departing point, but as you probably know, this does not mean that we still see very persistent gender gaps in the labor market, and part of this may be related to the fact that even if women are more educated than men, still we have very important differences in the fields where women get their education. So women basically are making choices that translate into lower expected earnings during the lifetime. So we have the typical example of STEM, where we've got a very low percentage at the international level of women working in these areas, and humanities, which is the contrary, a very high percentage of women concentrated there. And just a digression, what happens with economics, here what we have is the result from a survey that WAPLAC, which is a Women Economic in Latin America, is an initiative of LACEA, and we did a survey last year for taking into account universities in the region, and what we have that it's on average, the percentage of women in economics in Latin America is lower than 50, it's around 44% on average. We have differences, we have differences between countries, and if we compare, for example, with US, we have a higher percentage. You know, this idea of what happens with women in economics is very much discussed in the US and also in Europe, and we have a higher percentage of women in the field. it would be interesting to understand why, what is the differences, if it has to do with the contents of the programs, with other aspects. So even that, the idea is we have more educated women, but still in different areas. And in terms of labor force participation, this is probably the most important change that has taken place in labor markets in not only Latin America, but in the region. It's very clear. Here we have the labor force participation rate for men and women, and we see that the gap between the 80s and nowadays has become much smaller. But it's still very big. It's around 27%. On this what I'm presenting when I present Latin America average, it's unweighted average of countries, but it's still very high, the difference. And we have heterogeneity in the countries. There we have the different countries for the last year of the information. In all countries, we see the same pattern of increase in the period, a very strong increase, but still with high difference, with strong differences between countries. So this rapid growth in labor force participation of women, it has taken place in the 80s and mostly during the 90s, but then from the 2000s on, it has like decelerated or even became truncated. So what is the explanation for this? There is a study from Leonardo Gasparini and Mariana Marchioni that they argue that what happened during the 2000s had to do with the economic situation of the Latin American, with high earnings of men in the labor market, with very low rates in comparative terms, comparing with previous decades, very low rates of unemployment. So the expansion of social assistance in the region. So this can be interpreted, they said, not as such bad news if it is an efficient response to a situation of the labor market. But this situation, the stagnation in the labor force, in female labor force participation, has stayed almost unchanged in most of the countries. So there is now, we have a concern about if this will reverse, because we still are with rates that are much lower. The big difference with men in the region, and also we compare with with female rates in other countries. So there is a worry about if there are ways of trying to increase the female labor force participation in the short run, and what has to be done in the region to get that. When we go to female employment, things have been pretty much unchanged during the last decades. Basically, here we have the percentage, the distribution of women and men by sector of activity, and the high concentration of women in other services, very high concentration of women in other services and in commerce. That's basically more than 60% of women in the region work in these areas. And also, when we analyze by type of work, that this also taken from Gasparini Marchioni, what we see is that women are concentrated in some special types of work that are self-employed and skilled, and also salaried in small firms and with zero income workers. That's not a lot of the percentage of total women, but it's very different from the percentage of men. So what are the characteristics of this type of job where women are working in Latin America? Basically, they can be classified as more flexible in terms of the working arrangements. What happened with gender pay gaps? We see an important decline. Here we have the ratio of male over female earnings gap, and we see that it was men earned around 20% more on average in the 20s, and nowadays it has gone around 10%, so it's an important decline. And it happened as in all countries. There we see again the heterogeneities in the region, and these heterogeneities are interesting to analyze. Maybe here it's more interesting to see that what we have in this graph, we have female participation rate and the gender pay gap. And what we have basically is that the gender pay gap is smaller in countries where women have very low employment and participation rates. So basically, something that has been shown for developed countries is also happening in Latin America. We have a clear selection problem when we try to compare countries and compare these gender-wise gaps, simply like averages. We have this problem. There are some ways to try to correct for this selection problem, that it's basically addressing the fact that less educated women are not in the labor market at present. So if these women were working, the gender gaps would be different than what we have now. So as I said, we have some methodologies to address these different methodologies to address this selection correction. We have the traditional Heyman correction in 2 steps with an exclusion variable, and we also have these other 2, Olivetti and Pentrongolo, which is like an imputation method that assigns a wage to all potential workers, female workers, depending on where they will situate, if above or below the median wage. And there we have also Arellano and Bonhomme, which develop a selection model which can correct along the distribution. So just to give you some examples here of this work that is being done for Uruguay. Here to the left we have the earnings gap along the percentiles. So this is for Uruguay along the percentiles, and this is a research that will be presented in a following section from Maria Eugenia Echeverria. And what she does is, for the Uruguayan data, she corrects the gender gap along the wage percentiles with the Arellano and Bonhomme methodology. And what we see here is we see different things. First of all, that the gaps are higher in the lower part of the distribution, basically suggesting a sticky floors phenomenon, but not glass ceiling as previously work had found for Uruguay, but two decades ago. So this is not present now in this is updated data. And we also see that the correction implies a higher wage gap. And we also are working for Uruguayan data, but with looking at the long trend in the earnings gap, in the gender wage earnings gap. And we try to correct the observed gap, which is the one that it's the lower one, with the Olivetti and Pentrongolo methodology. Because our hypothesis was that what we see after 2006, that is an increase in this gender wage gap, it happened after an economic crisis. In 2002, there was a very strong economic crisis in Uruguay, and this is the recovery of the crisis. And so we had the hypothesis that this may have to do with compositional effects, but we still not find it that so clear with the correction. We are working on that, but it's like trying to understand better how this gender earnings differentials operate along the economic cycle. And the last point about trying to understand this gender differentials in earnings has to do with the presence of children. There is plenty of evidence that shows that the presence of children is pretty much associated to the participation of women and also to their wages. So we have some recent work. This is done by Inés Berniel and co-authors, that what they are doing is, as we now have, for some countries, longitudinal data, and we can track the moment in which the person, the men or women, had a child, we can track what happened with the labor market situation. In this paper, what they do is that for Chile, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay, they consider the employment, the evolution of employment. And the idea of the methodology is basically, it's an events methodology. Basically, the dependent variable is the probability of being employed, and the zero moment is the moment where the first child is born. So we know when that happened, and we can see wages before and after that moment. The comparison is with 1 year before the birth of the child. And the orange lines are males, so we see that basically in Chile and in Mexico, the results are clearer because they have more frequency in the data. In Peru and Uruguay, the data is not so good, and so the results are not so nicely presented as the other ones, but basically in all the countries it's the same. The orange line is what happens to the probability of employment for men, and it's basically unchanged. And the green line is what happens to women, and this has a very important drop, and it persists in time. And even if we consider 120 months after birth, so it's a lot of time, there are still effects on the probability of employment of the event of having a child. In this other work, it's also the same authors, Inés Berniel and co-authors. What they do is, for Chile, as they have the data for Chile, they consider not only employment rates, which was, this graph is the same as the other one, the first one in employment rates, but they can also consider the hours of work, the hourly wages, and the labor earnings. And what we see there is that there is also a decline in hours, an effect on hours of work for women and not for men, but for hourly wages, we see similar pattern for men and women, but basically the big gap, the big decline, the big effect on total labor earnings is because of employment rates, because of lower employment rates, and also part of it because of hours of work. And they also, in the case of Chile, here they are considering only mothers, and the colors now are not mothers and fathers, but now they are low education are the orange ones, and high education are the green ones. It's only for mothers. And we see that clearly there are effects for women in employment for all women, but the effects are bigger for low educated women. In terms of hours, the effects are concentrated on low-educated women, and in terms of informality, they also find this effect, higher probability of informality after the birth of the first child, and the drop in labor earnings, very clear for the pattern of what is happening in these countries. So, how should we interpret these motherhood penalties? What is behind these motherhood penalties? It's discrimination from employers. It's women decided to leave the labor force or to work less hours or change to more flexible jobs that most of the time implies less quality jobs in order to take care for children. And in case this is the second reason, is this because of gender identity norms, or is this because of the weakness of public policies related to childcare in the region? So this take us to what I called what is below the surface, and it's like the most dynamic part of research in this area nowadays, that has to do with preference, with social norms and attitudes, and also with unpaid work, which I will present some results. So a lot of the literature is bringing new insights about how humans make decisions in gender domains. And this is economics, bringing elements from other disciplines, from social psychology, for example, and trying to incorporate that in the way we look at the economic phenomenon. So this is trying to make a classification of a lot of literature that is there, and I will present obviously only some of this work, but we have a discussion about gender identity norms and gender stereotypes and how they are created. There is also a discussion about behavioral traits, trying to understand if men and women are different in some of these behavioral traits, for example, willingness to compete, or risk aversion, or willingness to negotiate, overconfidence and optimism, and also social preferences. So first, I will start with this literature on behavioral traits that mainly comes from lab and field experiments. And one of the questions is, are women more risk averse than men? And this may imply that women take less risk in their labor life, and this may be an explanation for some differences in the labor market. The reviews of experiment evidence tend to support this statement, so there are some important reviews that find this. In terms of attitudes toward competition, again, there is research that finds that men are on average more competitively inclined than women, so they tend to select competitive environments, or they feel more comfortable in competitive environments. And there is also experimental evidence about the fact that it's harder for women to negotiate. And basically, the idea is that women face greater social cost than men when initiating a negotiation, and especially if the one that is evaluating is a man, and especially also if there is some ambiguity about if it's correct or not to make that negotiation. So the idea is that the punishment for violating these sex stereotype social norms may be a factor that hinders women negotiating more. And just to show what is done for Latin America, there is a work from Eva Arceo that conducted an experiment in Mexico, and this result consistent with the notion that men and women behave differently when negotiating. With one of the findings is that men negotiate more assertively when their counterpart is a woman compared to when they are negotiating with another man. So there may be a lot of things going there in the interactions, and economics is trying to understand that. There is also another potential cause or explanation that has to do with social preferences. Again, from experimental evidence, there are works that try to explore if there are differences in preferences like altruism, reciprocity, and fairness. This may imply a lot of things. It may imply that women choose to do some kind of work, for example, that receives less rewards in terms of the labor trajectory, etc. And the evidence is more mixed here. It's like mixed in terms of what happens there, but the idea is that women tend to be more sensitive to social cues than men when taking these decisions. So there may be something there operating. Of course, this literature, it's important to say that it has a lot of critics, mainly from the feminist economics. We have studies, for example, Julie Nelson made 2 studies taking into account the same data that some of this evidence, and she finds that the distributions of men and women's responses is not so different. One thing is to consider the differences in the means, but there is overlapping, and so she says that she argues that the idea that women are more risk averse than men is weak. There are also other studies, and there you have Sentan, Van Staver, and Crosetto, that also they review this evidence, and they make important critiques in terms of the economic significance and also of the statistical significance of this literature. And as argued by Lundberg, this idea that there may be gender differences in behavior because of innate or fixed qualities of men and women may provide an easy and probably misleading supporting mechanism to think about gender gaps. So she makes it's like a warning in terms of this is very interesting. We can get a lot of evidence from these experiments, but we have to be very we have to be very careful about what this means when we try to understand differences. So what we think, the next question is, well, this difference in personal traits and in preferences, even if the evidence in some cases and in some specific point is mixed, but even if we accept that there are differences, what do these differences mean? No, it's this nature or nurture, and the idea is basically it may be that these gender differences come from a female preference for cooperation due to reproductive reasons. This is both proposed by evolutionary psychologists. So as I said, this is a very interactive field of research. And on the other hand, there is the nurture explanations, basically arguing that raising practices based on social norms that tolerate some behavior, for example, more competitive behaviors for boys and for girls, make that women end up displaying stronger dislikes for competitive situations or being more risk-aware, basically because of the identity norms that in which they are raised. So how this leads to the question of how are these preferences formed, and there is interesting work from, and very well-known work from Fernandez and Foglia, Blau, that they argue that immigrant women in the US replicate labor market behaviors and also fertility behaviors of women in their country of origin, even if they are living in the US, and so they face the other different economic and institutional constraints, but the idea is that the culture is influential and is transportable. And also this other work, it's the same idea, no, women who are more exposed to working mothers as adolescents, for example, because when they were at high school, most of the mothers of their peers were working. These women are more likely to work when they have children. There is when trying to understand, can this be passed from one generation to another? There is evidence, and here I am now concentrating on teenagers or children and teenagers, basically because I want to present some results for Latin America on this. And there is a lot of evidence for developed countries that basically that there is a positive correlation between more egalitarian parents, allocation of housework, and a less asymmetrical distribution of domestic chores between sons and daughters. So there is something happening in the household. Also with longitudinal data for the British cohort study, they found that a larger family size during childhood increases the share of housework that girls perform at the age of 16, but not boys. And it has also effects later on, for example, when women are 34 and they present worse labor market results. So what we are doing now, it's that for two countries, it's Colombia and Mexico, we try to analyze how are time use behaviors of boys and girls related to their parents' behavior. This time use are kind of different from most of the others in the country because it's very good, it's good data, and it's with very big sample sizes, so a lot of things can be, a lot of questions can be explored with this database. And basically what we do is we link the unpaid working hours of children, boys and girls. We estimate this for boys and girls. We link the time they dedicate to unpaid work. That unpaid work, the category includes housework and also care work. We link that to the time the mother and father dedicate, that is the first specification, and also, of course, other control variables. And then we link it to the gender gap between their mother and their father. And then what we also do is, but with a much more smaller sample, we look within a household where there is a boy and a girl, teenagers, and we try to see the difference in the time they dedicate to housework and what happens with their parents. So before presenting these results, just to show some interesting facts about teenagers' time. This is Colombia and Mexico. The green are the boys and the purple are girls. And in both countries, unpaid work, which is the first bars, are unpaid work. Women dedicate, these are girls aged 13 to 18, dedicate a lot more to unpaid work, both to household chores and to care work. And they tend to dedicate in paid work, both dedicate, the time they dedicate to paid work the amount is small, but men tend to dedicate more time. Women dedicate a bit more to education and also dedicate more time to personal care. In terms of media usage, there are differences, and in terms of leisure in both countries, the gender gap in time is very significant, is statistically significant, and boys dedicate more time to leisure. So what happens when we relate the time the boys and girls dedicate to unpaid work and what their parents do? In the case of boys, you see that the time they dedicate to unpaid work is positively correlated to mothers' unpaid work and also to fathers, and the coefficient for fathers is it's bigger, so that the role model of the father it's more important for boys. In the case of girls, the coefficients are similar in Colombia, and in Mexico the difference is not statistically significant. So it's basically the same effect for mothers and fathers. So there is some kind of transmission in terms of these models. And when we look at the gender gaps, this is for boys and girls. Sorry, in the previous one, the other column is instead of considering separately mothers and fathers' time, we consider the gender gap, which is mothers minus fathers, and it affects women but not men. So when the gender gap is higher in the household, within a household, girls tend to dedicate more time or to reproduce the behavior of mothers. Sorry. And here, when we look at the siblings, a girl and a boy, in a household, and we relate it to parents' gender gap, we have positive effects when we measure it in percentages. But in Colombia, in the case of minutes, no, it's not significant. But we tend to have a positive association. So when the gender gap between parents is higher, the gender gap between the siblings is also higher, and in the same direction, where girls tending to work more. So this is a very well-known fact in Latin America. In all countries, the time that women dedicate to unpaid work almost doubles the time that men dedicate to unpaid work, and it's a regularity in all countries. As I said, we have now time use surveys in all countries and can analyze these things, and this is a very important part of understanding what happens in the labor market. If we consider the total time, so there we have for each country, the dark side corresponds to unpaid, the dark side of the bars corresponds to unpaid work, and the lighter side to paid work, and green are women, and the gray are men. And when we add up the two, the differences are basically not significant. So the total time, there may be some difference in some country, but the basic picture is that what we have is a different allocation, but the total time is basically very similar. And here from other work with time use surveys for 4 countries, there, in the horizontal axis, what we have is the share of earnings of women. So as we move to the right, what we have is that women earn a bigger share of earnings in that household. And all these lines around the 10, this is the average time that men and women dedicate to unpaid work. And in the case of men, these red or violet lines correspond to men in these 4 countries. We basically don't see any association on its along the different share of women, but in the case of women, we see a very strong decreasing path. So as women earn a higher part of the income in the household, they tend to dedicate much less time to unpaid work. And I will skip this present some other evidence about these effects of time use, and also, so part of it has to do with this idea of the earnings, the share of earnings, but not only the share of earnings. When we test different hypotheses, if it's the important is relative earnings or absolute earnings, we tend to find that it is absolute earnings. And in this other work, what we do is we compare gender gaps in paid and unpaid work within a household and try to associate this with the situation of children in the household. So in terms of if they are attending to childcare services or public or education. Again, we have time use surveys for 4 countries. These are associations. There is no causality claim here. And an important thing to see is that in many of in our countries, these are only 4 countries, but the pattern is very similar in all Latin American countries. A very high percentage of households are only male earnings households. So this is very different from what we see in developed countries. We still have a very high percentage of households depending only on male income. And what we do is we relate gaps in unpaid work, in childcare, in other unpaid work, housework, and in paid work, and the variables that we consider as explanations are to see the association are if all children in the household aged 0 to 5 attend these childcare services, if some of them do but the others not, this is the second situation, and if none of these children attends these services. And what we find very, very clearly, and these are I only presented the coefficients of our interest variables, is that there is a clear association between all children assisting to childcare services and a smaller wage gap between the parent and the mother in terms of care work and in terms of unpaid work, and no effect on housework. So this is basically what we expect. And the second thing is that when we look at the explanation, this is basically because women reduce their time dedicated to care work. There are no effects in men, except in Uruguay and in Chile, that we have a reduction in men's time dedicated to childcare when children go to childcare services. It's a smaller reduction, but still in these 2 countries we have a difference. And if some children assist and the others not, it's the same that if all children were at home. So this also speaks about the need to have policies for different ages and to complement, for example, situations where you may have children at different ages. So I will skip this just to go to some concluding remarks. What we get from this perspective is conversions in some labor market indicators, but with very significant disparities and a slowdown in female or a stagnation in female labor force participation. Disparities, big disparities in the allocation of time between men and women within households, persistent effects on motherhood on women's trajectories, and the allocation of unpaid time between a couple strongly associated to the availability of childcare services for all children in the household. So when we think about the way ahead, we have like 2 big areas that we should try to advance. First, the cultural change towards more gender equity at households, and also stronger childcare public policies. So the intervention for this cultural change, I mean, we have to think like more innovative, I think, about how to change traditional gender stereotypes and to promote more egalitarian attitudes for young people, for children. So there is a huge area of research there, I think, of trying to understand more if there are interventions and what can be done. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
So I'm going to collect the little papers with questions on it. Maybe in the meantime, I will start with a question. So, to go back to the first set of slides, when you had this very interesting graph with the gender wage gap against women's labor market participation, and showing that this positive trend is actually hiding some selection effects. Each dot is a country. Are there some attempts to actually estimate and correct for the selection bias according to the different method you mentioned, and to see how this trend would look like? Would it flatten out if we would correct it for each single country?
Yes, that's exactly something that a researcher in our institute is doing that research, trying to see what happens when you correct using different selection methods. And our hypothesis is that a lot of that is selection. Mostly in Central American countries, you have very low participation and employment rates in Central America, and also very low differences in wages. So it's clearly a selection problem. Women who get into the labor market have better opportunities. Yes, but that is an interesting research question. Yes.
So can you tell us something about the gender gap from the perspective of the family as a unit that optimize their income with labor division where women earn less? Maybe the person who wrote this can help to clarify the question. It's a long sentence.
I think I may have got it. Can I try and answer? Yeah. That's also something that we are trying to look for some Latin American countries. If I understood well, you are saying, well, there may be some rationale about this decision of allocation of time, because unskilled women or women with low levels of education would earn, I mean, it may not be rational to go to the labor market and have to pay for services. And we do like simulations, and that is something that it's showing to work with Mayra Colache, and we were talking that it's like type of work that may be interesting for WAPLAC, because it's micro simulations of within countries, for different countries, and trying to see. And what we tend to find is that it's in most of the time it's rational if you assume that you will have to. So the answer would be we should have some public responses or childcare responses to be able to solve that problem. But yes.
So we have a question here on domestic violence. So have you studied the effect of gender violence in gender wage gap? So a relationship between the two.
I'm really not aware of. I think that of this kind of relationship or of research addressing this issue. What we have now, it's I think starting literature about trying to see what may cause domestic violence, what factors are associated with domestic violence, what events may generate that trying to understand behavior. I mean, it's like, but still I haven't seen that related to wage gap, but maybe one thing, as you know, it's one difficulty is that is the data to analyze this kind to answer this kind of problems.
Any other question, comment?
I have a question related with COVID. the pandemic. If you have some thoughts related with the idea that woman was the first to go to come to home, and the last to have the same level of employment, or because your data is before pandemic, so maybe you have some explanation or mechanism to try to understand why the outcome of the labor market showed that very impressive in Latin America.
Yes. I mean, with the COVID, like the first studies, I mean, were very much worried about if this changed, because women were much more affected and the participation rates and the employment rates went down. So would this mean something like a step backwards in terms of the advances of women in the labor market? What we see, and all that literature about the she sessions, etc., and what we see in general in Latin American countries is like 2 years later, women, the labor market situation, it's the same. This does not mean that there was obviously, for example, a loss of income, or there were problems for women in that period, but the labor markets have been able to return to the previous, in most countries, to the previous situation. Again, this is like, it's not advertising, but there is a paper that we did for Uruguay with, I think you may have known, the one from COVID and Uruguay, that we see that women after 2 years are basically in the same situation. And also, depending on the country, I mean, for example, in the Uruguayan experience, there was a good response, I would say, of the unemployment insurance, and that is a big difference, because during the period, women suffer and the labor market inception suffered, but also there are differences depending on what were the policies available. In the case of Uruguay, a lot of women entered the unemployment insurance program. I mean, they had a higher probability than men of entering that, maybe for different reasons. We're trying to understand why, but it also depends on the responses, yes, from the policies.
More questions? Javier?
Thank you, Veronica. What you showed us was very interesting, but it was still mainly averages. So I don't know whether you're diving into differences across ethnicities, so ethnic groups, to which extent some groups, some women in these groups face persistent gender differences, what others might have seen their situation over time become better. So have you, are you diving into that? Also regional difference, for example, urban versus rural, or small provinces or sectors. So can you tell us something about that?
You're referring to time use or to labor market or in general?
In general, so both time use and labor market, yeah.
I mean, in labor market, we have like a lot of evidence about the differences between some groups and others. So we have these penalties for indigenous and black people, and that is well documented. But in terms of other variables, that the ones that are below the surface, I see that we know less about. In time use surveys, for example, the kind of data that we have in Latin America does not allow to do a lot of this analysis. So it's like, it may be in Colombia, you may try to do that, but it's difficult to really understand more about the behaviors and time use with this data. I mean, it's excellent that we have this data and we can see some things that previously we didn't know, but the possibilities of, for example, disaggregating are very limited. Yeah. It's also that these surveys are very expensive. We have to say that it's not that countries don't know how to do it, but are very expensive because it's difficult to collect the data on what people do during the day. So there are a lot of complexities. And for regions like Latin America, where the statistics systems still are weak, I mean, we have a lot there to go to advance and try to see, for example, to be able to see more heterogeneities in the population.
Last question. I'll get one for the road. To get back to the gender wage gap and the top and the bottom of the iceberg put together, now that we have some data that might contain the risk aversion, sense of competition, sense of cooperation. Are there some attempts to put that in a good old ORACA decomposition and see how much these psychological traits are explaining wage gap or explain selection in particular jobs that explain wage gaps?
Yes, the thing is that sometimes you are asking me if I've seen that kind of research or no. The difficult thing is that this evidence from experiments, and many times you don't have like wages or to. I mean, you to do this kind of Oaxaca's composition, you will need a survey data that also asks personal traits and it's. I mean, it's not up to my knowledge. You don't have that data. Yeah.
Okay, so we have just to thank Veronica one more time for this very nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we are coming back to the rooms for the two last parallel sessions of the day. Thank you.